Hello, everyone, and welcome. Big virtual welcome to the Aspen Institute. Thank you so much for joining our conversation today that we're calling From Digital Hate to Real World Violence. My name is Zeki Barzinji, and I'm a program director here at Aspen Digital. It's my honor to host this important discussion with some truly incredible people. We're especially excited about today's event, as it'll hopefully be just the first in a series of conversations on how emerging technologies impact underrepresented and often marginalized communities. Here at Aspen Digital, we think it's important that we use our privilege and convening power to amplify those communities that are too often excluded in these discussions and the development of new technologies, but are almost always disproportionately negatively impacted by them. So if you enjoyed today's conversation and would love to see Aspen Digital do more of these types of events, or if you have ideas for similar topics and experts to include, please feel free to let us know by tweeting us at Aspen Digital. Now onto the topic at hand, from digital hate to real world violence. Last month, at least one of our speakers today was in the room when President Biden signed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which was a direct response to the skyrocketing violence against Asian American and Pacific Islander communities across the country in the midst of the global pandemic. At the same time, Jewish communities across the country are raising alarm bells around a spike in anti-Semitic violent attacks. Muslim Americans have been experiencing a steady increase in Islamophobic attacks over the past few years. And of course, anti-Black racism and violence continues to tear through our nation, despite all the progress that we may think we have made. But although we're talking about lots of different communities that seem to be experiencing higher levels of bigotry and violence directed at them, there also seem to be some common threads that link them together. The first is the fact that much of the hate and bigotry we're seeing often comes from the same sources. Just yesterday, Attorney General Merrick Garland said in a speech that in the FBI's view, the top domestic violent extremist threat comes from racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically those who advocated for the superiority of the white race. In other words, violent white supremacy is seen as one of the single biggest sources of hate crimes and attacks against a whole range of communities. Acknowledging that intersectional source of hate and bigotry is fundamental to understanding how we can collectively confront it and also empower all our communities. The second major through line through all of these rises and attacks against our communities, and the reason for our conversation today, is that in the vast majority of violent, hate-based, real-world attacks against our communities, technology has played a central role in one form or another. Whether it's the spread of dangerous misinformation and disinformation intentionally aimed at inciting suspicion against entire communities, or whether it's old and new digital platforms being used for people with hateful ideologies to recruit vulnerable individuals and coordinate real-world actions, there seems to be a direct pipeline between digital hate and real-world violence. As just one example, just last week, the FBI actually sent a letter to Congress with an urgent warning that QAnon followers may soon move from being digital soldiers to real-world violence. So that's what we want to discuss today with our distinguished panel of speakers who work directly at the front lines of both protecting and empowering so many different communities. We'll talk about that pipeline of hate. We'll talk about what the tech industry and policymakers should be doing about it, and also how communities can digitally empower themselves to stop hate and amplify their own voices. So without further ado, let me introduce our guests. First up, we have Emily Chi, who is the Assistant Director of Telecommunications, Technology, and Media at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, where she's responsible for developing and providing public policy research, strategies, analysis, and education on telecommunications, technology, and media diversity. Prior to joining Advancing Justice AAJC, Emily worked as a researcher on various projects at the Harvard Kennedy School, including Product and Society at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy, and the Technology and Public Purpose Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Also joining us is Khurram Zaman, the CEO of Fifth Tribe, a digital agency serving the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area based out of the 1776 startup co-working space. Khurram also serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. In his professional capacity, Khurram has provided product development and digital strategy services to clients as diverse as the Department of Defense, Kaiser Permanente, Oxfam America, and the ADL. His writing has been published in Forbes, Entrepreneur, and Technical.ly, which might also be pronounced technically. And finally, last but not least, Brad Jenkins. Brad is the founder and CEO of Enfranchisement Productions. Before joining Will Ferrell's Funny or Die as managing director and executive producer, Brad spent 4 years serving as President Obama's associate director in the White House Office of Public Engagement. From the White House, Jenkins brought together creative executives, thought leaders, and some of the world's biggest stars to advance the president's agenda, culminating in the Emmy Award-winning Between Two Ferns interview on the Affordable Care Act. At Funny or Die and Enfranchisement Productions, Jenkins produced over 50 social impact campaigns with organizations, foundations, PACs, and other organizations. Most notably, Brad produced history-making campaigns for the startup nonprofit Rise, and which was founded by Nobel Peace Prize nominee Amanda Wynn. Those are our speakers, and we're looking really forward to getting into our conversation. One final bit of housekeeping. On the second half of this program, we're going to take questions from you, the audience. To ask a question at any point during the program, those on Zoom can submit your question using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, somewhere around here. Please include your name and affiliation in your question if you feel comfortable, as that can sometimes provide some helpful context. So before we get to the audience, I'd like to kick off this conversation with a couple of questions. So for my first question, I think we just want to establish a baseline when we're talking about hate and hate speech directed towards our communities. And the question that I think that it's been on my mind, and I know on many other people's minds, is, are we right now experiencing the climax of hate towards our communities? Like, is this the peak, or could things potentially get much worse? I remember even in the last year of the Obama administration, I was serving as a White House liaison to Muslim Americans and Arab Americans, and we thought we were experiencing the peak of Islamophobia and Islamophobic hate crimes against our communities. And now it's been, that's been more than 4 years ago, and that clearly was not the case. So our baseline question is, what is the current state of our communities and the current sort of state of the hate complex and its actions against us? So to get us started, Emily, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you. I know AAJC is working hard to collect stories directly from AAPI folks who have experienced hate. What are you hearing from the communities themselves, and sort of what are your general thoughts on this idea of, are we at the peak, or can things get much worse when it comes to hate?
Sure. Well, thank you so much to the Aspen Digital Institute for having us. This is a critical conversation, and we're thankful to be a part of it. So in terms of, is this the peak? Is this as bad as it can get? Unfortunately, history proves otherwise. Things have certainly been worse for the AAPI community in the past. We've seen the actual law of the land bar people from immigrating to this country. We've seen discrimination allowed by government entities. So we've certainly seen it been worse, especially tied to disease. We've seen entire Chinatowns quarantined in Honolulu. There was actually a Chinatown that was burned to the ground in defense of protecting a community against unclaimed conflation of Chinese Americans and Asian Americans to disease. So what we're seeing is unfortunately not new, and it certainly could get worse if history is any indication. We're seeing, a record number of hate incidents being reported. We know that just because there wasn't reporting before doesn't mean that any of it is new, but it is alarming to see the rates at which they're being reported currently. And what's additionally alarming is how targeted our elderly populations have been. So that's an added element. And what's also concerning is the rate at which we're getting incidents reported from the youth and students. So an entire new generation is now being exposed to hateful incidents, violence, and harassment in a way that they haven't experienced in their lifetime. And that certainly raises the possibility of an increase as we see, not just new victims from a new generation, but also new perpetrators.
Thanks. It's very helpful as a baseline and obviously sobering. Khurram, I wanted to turn to you. I know much of your work has involved tracking the online activities of different types of hate groups. What do you think? Are we seeing an increase of activities? Could things get a lot worse? Is that the trends that we're seeing?
Well, thank you, Zeki and Aspen Digital for having us today. This is a very important topic. This is a topic I'm very passionate about and spend a lot of time kind of delving into. I would say that there's three levels of how we would evaluate this, whether violent extremism is increasing or decreasing. So one is chatter, the second one is activities, and the third is actions. And so chatter, it kind of ebbs and flows, and think of it as like an iceberg. And so what we see in the public discourse on social media, that's kind of like the chatter. But even when there isn't that much chatter that's happening, there's a lot of these extremists are engaging in organizing activities. And in some of those activities, then you have people that get inspired and they engage in actions. So I would say if you look at white supremacy, that's very contemporary. Everyone's talking about it right now. But even the stuff on the jihadist side, we're starting seeing groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda and other parts of the world are starting to pick up their online organizing. And so that's what we need to be cognizant of, is that even where there is chatter or there isn't any chatter, we really want to focus on is what sort of activities are these groups engaging in. One thing that we're seeing right now is Tom Hanks's son, I think his name is Chet Hanks, he made a comment about White Boy Summer, which was kind of comical, but unfortunately, a lot of the white supremacists have actually latched on to that, and they're organizing White Lives Matter protests in pretty much trying to get in all 50 states and all over the world. And so it's one of those things where it's really hard to gauge this entire sort of nexus of activity. But we want to look at stuff that's not just happening on the clear web, but also on the dark web, also on chat platforms like Telegram. So I would say it depends on the group, and it depends on what's happening in media and social media, and how you're evaluating it. But overall, it seems like I think as a society, we feel like, hey, we're kind of reaching the end, and then something else happens that puts it to another level. And I think my personal opinion is that this is not just the problem America's facing, but this is a problem that all modern states and democracies are facing. And we're going to really start seeing the impact of polarization on our countries, and we need to take it not only as a local domestic issue, but also as a global international issue as well.
Thanks. Very, very helpful. Brad, so I know much of your work involves around empowering communities to sort of tell their own stories and offer their own narratives in ways that tend to be suppressed. I guess sort of in a bigger picture way, do you feel like anti-API narratives and stories are gaining more traction these days, given the context? And is that contributing to sort of what we're seeing in terms of spikes in hate towards our communities?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is, we were chatting before the Zoom started, and Emily, I'm going to steal what Emily said. I mean, hate against our community is not new. It's essentially like foundational to the Asian American experience. I think that what we're experiencing now, I'm the eternal optimist. I think that's the reason why you guys probably had me on here. Except for Chet Hanks. I'm not optimistic about Chet, but look, I think that what we found here in this moment are millions of Americans and also millions of people across the world who've been galvanized into action. And I've had the privilege, I have been doing all of the creative and the culture work for the Asian American Foundation, which had been, the plan of launching TAF happened a year ago. It just so coincided with this movement. And the reality is, we cannot allow, again, perfectly put, we cannot allow this foundational white supremacy to strike fear, to define this moment. And I think that what we found is the response to has been so inspiring for me in so many different ways. I think you can, we talk about digital tools. I mean, just think about the digital tools of the mega GoFundMe that happened in the wake of all of this violence. $6.7 million that's been raised going to local Asian American groups all around the country. Or think about the number of people that, again, for the first time, have really started unpacking and learning the history of Asian Americans. And the work that I do is that narrative change. The work that I do is this violence, from my opinion, is a powder keg. It's not one thing. Violence never is. Racism never is. It's an outcome of poverty. It's an outcome of a white supremacist in chief that scapegoated our community each and every day, and his enablers allowing him to do it. It's an outcome of COVID. It's an outcome of so many different factors: homelessness, drug addiction. When all of these things come together, communities are vulnerable. It just so happened that our community was the one. It may be the Jewish community next. It may be the LGBT community next. And so what we really need to do, in my opinion, and what I've seen so beautifully done by AJC and others, is galvanize the country to center the Asian American story. Because a lot of these violent acts, again, I get emotional thinking about it, but a lot of these violent acts are coming from people who don't see themselves. They don't see themselves when they're attacked. They don't view that Asian American elder as their elder. And a lot of that is going to have to be breaking down these barriers, building bridges, and doing the cultural storytelling work.
Excellent. No, that's very helpful. And I think it's a really good way to sort of pull us back into the bigger picture of what we're witnessing right now. But I want to get a little bit more specific here and dive kind of into the central question, which is, what role is technology specifically playing in enabling the spread of hate? And maybe, Karam, we can start with you. Just given your work, what are some specific ways that those with hateful ideologies are leveraging specific types of platforms and emerging technologies to sort of create this pipeline between speech and chatter, as you mentioned, and direct actions, violent actions against communities?
That's a great question. It's a hard question. I think the biggest observation you'll see is that whether it's different kinds of extremists, they all kind of follow a similar pattern. Whereas in the sort of 2010s, a lot of the radicalization that was happening through friends and family and community networks. And so if you wanted to be a white supremacist, you'd go to the KKK rally. If you were a jihadist, it's because you came from a region of the world, or it's more geographically sort of tied and network based. What's changed, especially since groups like ISIS kind of came on the scene, is that personal touch is no longer needed. And you're seeing whether it's white supremacists or jihadists, they're getting radicalized almost entirely online. And what we saw in the past few years was that white supremacists, they had different targets in terms of communities. So they targeted Muslims in New Zealand, they targeted Jews in America. There was one that targeted a Walmart because he wanted to kill as many Latinos as possible. And so the target community was different, but what was common was how they got radicalized. And there were on image boards like 8kun and 4chan, and a lot of the communication happened on chat platforms like Telegram. So the digital platforms, when we're talking about them, we're not talking about the big tech companies like Facebook, Google, Twitter, YouTube. We're talking about all of tech. And so this will go into sort of the solutions. Is big tech really the solution? Probably not, because whenever you shut them down, they go and they either find other platforms in other countries, or what happens is they create their own platforms. And so, for example, of going to another country, the founder of the base, he left America, he went to Russia. He's out of US jurisdiction. He can say whatever he wants. The founders of Gab, they said, you know what? If you don't want to host our website, we'll make our own website, our mobile app, our own browser. And so they're going ahead and they're creating their own sort of digital infrastructure. And so what this tells us is that, sort of the whack-a-mole solutions that we're trying out as a society, they're adapting, they're evolving. And so the digital platforms that are there, they're key to how these extremists promote their messaging, how they do recruitment, how they celebrate attacks. But it's still also very decentralized. It's almost like a hive where no one is really like commanding them to do stuff, but they're just kind of putting stuff out there. and hoping somebody gets inspired and takes an action. And that's what you see, like I said, with ISIS and some of the neo-Nazi groups just this week are calling for accelerationism, where they want to say, hey, just grab a gun and go out and shoot somebody. So you're seeing that kind of activity where it's not directly command and control style that you saw with other groups of the hierarchy. It's more like put stuff out there on the web, and some, susceptible, vulnerable young person might get inspired and do something. So there's no doubt that the role of tech is very crucial to this discussion.
Thanks. Emily, anything else to add sort of in what you're seeing from your vantage point?
Sure. We're certainly concerned about, the fringe groups, extremists, but one of the things that we have been working on addressing is how normalized hateful rhetoric and incitement of violence has become. So yes, we're concerned about the 4chans, the alternative websites, but even on YouTube, on Facebook, we're seeing hateful rhetoric, scapegoating, the conflation of, for example, Muslim Americans with terrorists and jihadists, and language like blame China, China has to repay for what they've done, hold Chinatowns accountable. All of that type of language has become very normalized. We do see it on outlets like Fox News, but we're also seeing it on, Facebook posts, Twitter posts from mainstream politicians. We're seeing a lot of YouTube channels that are using more radical language, and seeing it so prolific on all of these mainstream channels indicates to folks that this is reasonable, that this is mainstream, that it's an acceptable line of thinking. And so we've seen, kind of like what the other panelists have alluded to, but it's not just this, organized attack, pre-planned, well-coordinated. It's the random attacks that are just fueled by this normalized hate, where individuals, it's just part of their day-to-day thinking, like COVID is hard, the economy's been bad, everyone's sick, and it's all to the fault of Asian Americans and other minority groups. Therefore, if I'm having a bad day, I'm just going to act out against them. And that's really what's concerning, is it's not just the extremists anymore. It's part of our society's consciousness now.
Thanks. I think that's super helpful. It's really helpful, I think, to look at this as not being a binary, right? It's not either you're a hateful white supremacist who is all these kind of subgroups. There are several layers, many layers of digital hate that range from being very specific and very unique to different platforms, but there's also just general broader trends in narratives and conversations that kind of more insidiously move rhetoric in a more extreme direction. And that can also just as much contribute to real world violence. Brad, anything you wanted to jump in on?
I just want to 100% agree with Emily that this is not extremists. I mean, if we recall, the UN wrote a report over a year and a half ago saying that, again, not to keep bringing up the former president, but that his words would have outcomes, right? This is not, we knew that when you weaponize words and scapegoat a community like this is what's going to happen, right? So I think it is sometimes easy to place blame on these very nefarious subgroups and dark internets and subreddits, et cetera. But this was happening in plain sight in the Oval Office. And I think it again, it's instructive, and we all have to do a better job, right? And I know AAJC, and there are so many organizations that were speaking out every day saying this is unacceptable. But there were so many people, members of Congress, members of the media, name an influencer, that were complicit, that thought it was funny, that thought it was cute. And these have real effects and real outcomes. And so I agree. I am worried. I mean, look, I'm a dad, not to pull the dad card here, but just think about that for a second. Think about an 8th grader seeing the president of the United States use these words, Kung Flu. How do you think that that's going to affect not just that child, but an entire community, entire generation? We will not see the outcomes of this disastrous presidency for decades, in fact. And we do, again, I think we also have to be, I feel like sometimes we're very quick to normalize things. We're very quick to be like, all right, this is just the new status quo. let's just run with it. We have to unpack this. There's a lot of trauma, and there's a lot of pent up rage, and there's a lot of, in my opinion, a lot of work that needs to be done to fix what just happened for the past 4 years. And again, thank God for AJC and other organizations that have been doing this, but the work continues because these are not extremists. These are moms, soccer moms. These are people in Facebook groups. This is not just the dark internet.
No, that's super important. And so I think, moving towards more action-oriented takeaways that we can get from this conversation. We do want to talk about the role of the tech industry and also the role of policymakers in addressing these issues. And, as Khurram and Emily and Brad, you've all kind of gone into this idea that there's no easy one size fits all solution, because we're talking about different types of actors across a whole spectrum of what you would call hate, right? So I guess the question that I would put forward, and maybe Emily, we can start with you this time. What should the tech industry be doing as a whole? Are there steps they should be taking? Maybe just to sort of throw this out there as a topic of conversation. Facebook, just to choose one company, created the Facebook Oversight Board, whose job was to sort of review Facebook's policies when it comes to addressing all types of different issues. Facebook Oversight Board, most recently made its announcement that it was recommending that the ban on Donald Trump from Facebook be extended. But there's been a lot of also controversy and criticism of the Facebook Oversight Board. That's just one example. You don't have to talk about that specifically, but because there is such a diverse range of issues here, what are some concrete things that the tech industry should be doing? And is there stuff that's already being done that they're doing well? Emily, I'll start with you, and then maybe go to Brad and Khurram.
Sure. I do have to applaud the tech industry for stepping up. I think with the recent events that started last summer with Black Lives Matter, folks are starting to realize, we can't put racial justice issues in a separate bucket. It affects everything that we do, including the products that tech builds. And they're inevitably a part of the problem, because whatever they do is going to amplify the problems that society already faces. And I do think that they have had this collective awakening of like, okay, what we do is not apolitical. It's impossible. No matter what, it's going to affect the rest of the world in a way that we need to be really intentional about before we launch things, right? Not afterwards. Those band-aid fixes aren't going to work. So I do think that there is a reckoning and more critical thinking about how they can get ahead of the problem. On the Facebook Oversight Board, we did submit comments to the board about that decision that was pending about Trump's account. And mostly, the discussion was about the insurrection. But the point we wanted to raise was what Brad just brought up, which is, the former president did use that platform to organize and encourage and normalize hate against entire communities of people, the Black community, during Black Lives Matters, Muslim Americans with the ban, and terrible immigration policies, most recently Asian Americans. But a whole lot of different groups, right? And we wanted to point out, he may not have explicitly encouraged violence against these communities, but those words that he chose to use have power and, stoke existing racism, the perpetual foreigner, the model minority myth, the idea that minorities are somehow always going to be responsible for the problems that white Americans might face. And that did lead to real world violence, like we've discussed. And so the platforms have a responsibility to take responsibility, not just for the explicit events we can tie to platforms and the content that's on there, but also what's being implicitly done to change the views and the minds of users. So that's something that we've been working on trying to push. Congress has been paying attention to this as well. There was a subcommittee hearing in March that we also submitted comments to, where, we have to think, what are the civil rights and human rights violations that are at play here, and how can we keep content more accountable to, not just like new things that we want to propose, but the existing community guidelines. And another thing that we're really pushing for is how to make sure that all communities that are impacted are represented at these tech companies, right? Because as long as the decision makers are affluent, privileged, white male, whatever it may be, people who already hold power in the society, we're never going to see the views of minorities and their experiences represented until it's already too late and the damage has been done. So we want to see companies, not just giving their money to organizations that are doing great work and hosting, guest speakers, which is encouraging and important, but we want them to internalize change and think about who's making decisions, how are they collecting information, from which sources, and how is that all informing the work that they do day to day in building these platforms and products, because ultimately that's going to have an effect on all of this.
Yep, inclusion at every step of the way, right? I think it's an absolutely important point. Brad, same question to you. Is there things that the tech industry can be doing to better protect and empower our communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think Emily just nailed the head on the protect. I mean, I think in the empower, because you have to do offense and defense, right? And I do think, so much of my work is on this rising generation, right? Like it's on this generation where there's a jump ball. Could they be the greatest generation ever, or could they devolve right into what we're seeing? And I will tap my hat, my Brooklyn Nets hat, by the way. Go Nets. To all the platforms, like what they did during API Heritage Month, and I think it was obviously in response to the tragedy and the violence, was epic. Like I've never seen anything like it before, whether it's TikTok having like a literally like front and center hashtag for Asian American creators and giving them a platform, whether it's Instagram, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twitter, whether it's media companies who just for a full month was being proactive in figuring out ways to tell the story of the Asian Americans. Speaking of the Brooklyn Nets, the NBA and their partnership with the Asian American Foundation and other Asian American groups like AAJC, it was really remarkable to see. And to be honest, it's again, talking to some of the people at these companies, it's a long time coming. They've been asking for this, right? They've been asking for this commitment and they've been asking for this focus. I'll use the NBA as an example again, because Kevin Durant had a historic game last night. The vast majority of NBA fans are Asian, right? Quite literally, like China. And so for them, for the very first time, to have a very strategic and thoughtful plan on how we were going to engage the Asian American community, not just during API Heritage Month, but for the full year. Those are the types of things that it's not just tech companies, right? Because I think we're all in agreement that while it is important to deplatform, white supremacists like Donald Trump, it's not going to solve everything. We can't deplatform everyone. This is a conversation that we're always having. And so the more that we're going to find allies, the more that we're going to find people that can center our humanity and our experience, the less we're going to have more of these awful, awful incidents.
Thank you, brother. That's super comprehensive. Khurram, I'm going to have the same question for you, but I'm going to pull in an audience question for you that I think is a little bit more specific, that might be more uniquely suited to you. This question comes from Bree Powell. She asks, they ask if deplatforming leads to extremists to the edges, is there any inherent benefit to driving those conversations off the larger platforms? Is there any evidence that pushing extremists out, even into their own corner, is actually better? So this is sort of, I think, a fundamental debate that you kind of talked about earlier. If you kick them off the big platforms, doesn't it just create extra spaces for them to thrive? I guess the question is, could there be an argument that that's actually a beneficial thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that for me, I see the problem of violent extremism again as a universal human condition. And it's not something that we see limited to America. In India, for example, you'll see how there's a lot of social media content generated against the autonomous people in Kashmir trying to get independence from India. You see how it's being used in the farmers movement. You see it in China with the Uyghurs. So digital platforms are used by state actors and non-state actors to achieve these ends, and they engage in bigotry and hate of target groups to achieve those political ends. And so it's not something that it's not like I think it'd be great to have a switch. We could just press it, and all of a sudden all these problems go away. The reality of it is that Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google, they've all done the best that they can at deplatforming all of these bad actors. Where it gets complicated is, like I said, in different countries, they have different rules. And so in India, you saw just, I think in the past few weeks, they weren't happy with what Twitter was doing over there. I think there was other parts of the world that were doing something similar. So it's deplatforming. One, when you set that precedent of what is good speech, what is bad speech, here in America, we might try to say that we're like the best democracy, and we'll try to do a good job at it. The world, you could see them abuse that privilege in the interest of national security to do that. The second thing is that I think the Capitol siege is a great example of how digital platforms are really integral, and how all these different groups collate. So if you told me like 5 years ago, one, that Donald Trump would be president, two, a group of people that engaged in a conspiracy theorist named Q would create a self-organizing movement that would basically attract white supremacists, neo-Nazis, militias, and common Americans and raid the Capitol, I would say you're crazy, right? But that's exactly what happened on January 6th, unfortunately, was that, the president was tweeting and he had a rally in front of the White House. And then there was all these, QAnon is on all these image boards like 4chan and 8kun. And then all these militias, the Oath Keepers, it seems like they were communicating through Telegram. So the thing about it is we can, kicking them off of Facebook, kicking them off of Google. One, it raises a question of, who are they to decide what is good speech and bad speech? And in other parts of the world, the rules they set over here, they have implications for activists. And if we're regulating speech here, and in the interest of national security, it sets a precedent for other countries to do the same. And we want to make sure that we're creating a universal solution to some of these challenges. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think they've done, in the beginning, I think a lot of it was sort of like CYA, where it's like, hey, let's just take down this content. And I know for Twitter, as an example, when ISIS had something like 200,000-300,000 tweets per day on Twitter, the way that Twitter's policy was like, hey, you report it, we'll take it down. But the problem was that ISIS, sort of the digital soldiers would basically just run a script and create a new account within a few minutes, and they were just back up and running. And they would mock Twitter for doing that. And so just taking down the platforms wasn't sufficient. And then you had Anonymous got involved, and they started basically getting much more involved in identifying these users and taking them down permanently. And then Twitter started using machine learning to kind of figure out who's trying to create these accounts over and over again. So I think there's a lot of room for what the tech space can do, but it's not just big tech. It's not just Facebook's responsibility, Google's responsibility, and Twitter's responsibility. They've done quite a bit. We need to take it as a universal approach and think of it almost like it as an epidemiological problem. If a virus spreads, it doesn't really care if you have a building or not. If they can infect somebody, they're going to get there. So events like the Unite the Right, the Capitol Siege event, those are all what I would say are like super spreader events, where all these disparate fringe groups, all of a sudden they have a moment where they can break out into the mainstream and get stronger and more entrenched and more emboldened. So we need to think very, very, very differently about how we're going to solve these problems. And some of those solutions are scary solutions. And what I mean by that is that those are things that as a democracy, we need to think very, very deeply about. So with the Capitol Siege, a lot of people use facial recognition. So the Proud Boys is an example. A lot of those folks were identified through a platform that was built in, I think, in the Ukraine. And people would take an image and upload it, and it scraped all these photos, and you could figure out who that person was. You can mine social media all the time and see if somebody's posting extremist content. You could do geolocation. So the technology part is not the hard part here, it's the policies. So should Facebook, should they be able to use facial recognition to determine if somebody's an extremist? Do we want Facebook to do that? Do we want to give that power to Congress? Imagine if the previous administration had those powers, right? So the technology part of it, there's a lot more we can do. The question about is whether we should do it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and one that I want to take to Emily, because Emily, I know that AAJC obviously is engaged in various policy conversations. In addition to the tech industry itself, what should we be looking to our policymakers to do to address these issues? Khurram basically outlined a bunch of different, often competing ideals that are at play when it comes to even beginning the conversation of how do we address this through policy. One thing that's obviously come up for debate is whether or not Section 230 needs to be updated or revised. There's arguments pro and against, and both sides say that it's a matter of free speech. So, Emily, I don't know if you have a perspective on that, if there's work that you're seeing, or if there's things that AGC is sort of proposing that policymakers do to address this, because honestly, it's a pretty complex issue.
Sure. And, certainly things like Section 230 reform are going to be part of the short-term solution, and giving day-to-day guidelines and better clarity to the regulators, as well as the folks on the tech side doing the moderating, because it is an outdated law. I think we can all agree on that, no matter which side of the debate we're on. But like it was mentioned in the last point, that's only part of the problem. That's not going to be a long-term fix, because no matter what the new Section 230 guideline is, bad actors are going to find their ways around it. There'll be a new way that bad information is circulated. We're seeing with mis and disinformation that it's not on mainstream platforms exclusively. It's in Asian languages too. It affects our communities as well, and is making them more radicalized as well. So we're seeing it on private messaging apps, like the underground websites, like areas like were mentioned that wouldn't fall under Section 230 review anyway. So that's not really the long-term solution, although a necessary part of the conversation. So we're really thinking about, what are the root causes of this? And, Brad brought this up earlier, but education is key, right? So making sure that this nation, everyone here has, a collective, accurate memory of what has happened in this nation, so that we can actually learn from those mistakes and move forward. And in the Asian American community, it's critical to think about, the perpetual foreigner and the racism that has always existed in our society, so that it's not new and we don't see this repeated recycling of the same tired stereotypes and hate speech. So that's key, but also within education, I think media training and digital literacy is also key, because this content is going to continue being produced and proliferated. So we really have to empower individuals who are consumers of such media to be able to more effectively, distinguish between what's accurate, what's actually real, and what's being used to manipulate me. So that's really critical that we dedicate resources, that Congress takes action to bring more robustness around that area on the mis and disinformation front. I'd also add, the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act was great for this, and it's just a start. But another thing that was important was dedicating resources directly to the community to help victims and to create more stability in our communities that can address some of the underlying issues that make us more vulnerable. And the other thing is we need better data, and that is something that the federal government has failed to do over and over again, where minorities, including APIs, have regularly been excluded from everything from, broadband access data to things like hate crimes, to things like, why aren't we included at the table for discussions on immigration, on SNAP benefits, on healthcare? It's because there isn't robust data, and that perpetuates this idea that we're model minorities, we don't need these services, we don't face these problems, so we don't need to be a part of the conversation. And that's continuing to harm us by perpetuating negative stereotypes and these stories that drive hate. But also, there's a real material consequence, which is our communities are being excluded from these services and conversations that could really, really benefit us.
Absolutely. And there's been a couple of questions that have come in that are sort of along the same general idea. One from Abbas Barzagar from the Horizon Forum. He asked, do you think it's possible to maintain the integrity of an open, interoperable internet while also regulating speech that is not criminal? I put that out there. Does anybody want to respond to that one? Kind of touched on it. I think, Khurram, you sort of seem to be leaning towards it might not be possible, but I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Why is Abbas always asking the hard questions? Yeah, I think whether or not it's possible, I think we have to make it work. There's a lot at stake here, not just here domestic in the United States, but the world that we want to live in for our children in the next 20, 30 years. I mean, imagine a world where states start collapsing, like look at what's happening in Syria. imagine as climate change progresses and states get weaker and these radical groups that suddenly are on the fringes end up becoming mainstream. I don't think any of us want to live in a world like that. So whatever the solution is, I think we need to really work together to start figuring it out. And I don't think it's one specific individual or group that's going to do it, or one state. It has to be a collective effort. And a cross-sectional approach makes the most sense. We need government, we need the private sector, we need communities, we need academics and researchers. This is a very complex, thorny issue amongst the many issues that humanity is facing, and we got to figure it out.
Brad, look like you had something to say.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Quorum. It's not, there's no silver bullet. I mean, I will say that there's so much work to be done, y'all. Like, that's the reality. I'm not sure if you guys saw that launch report, but the fact that most Americans couldn't name a single prominent Asian American, and the only one that they could name, I think only like 23% could name Bruce Lee, who's not been around for decades. And then they can name Jackie Chan. So like, there's so much work that needs to be done. And I know a lot of times we talk about our community. We talk about how do we uplift the 23 million APIs in America, and how do we provide access, and how we lift up our community. But the reality is the real work has to be done with everyone else. We really do need to create entry points for white Americans and Latinx Americans and African Americans to understand who we are. And a lot of that is on the shoulders of media. A lot of that is on the shoulders of, storytellers in Hollywood who, again, never center our story. We're always perpetually the sidekick or the nerd. These things are changing, but again, it's not a surprise. It's not a surprise to me that no one could name anyone other than Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee. Because just think about the deluge of bad television that we have to watch, where every single main character growing up was a white dude who looked like the other white dude. So, but things are changing, right? And so I think, I don't know. I think the big thing that we're all in agreement on is that I don't know, not to sound cheesy, but we have a lot of work to do, and this is not ending. I think, Zachy, you said at the top, is this the peak? I don't think so. I think that this is the tip of the iceberg. And when the next thing happens, when there's another opportunity, whether it's another president or another senator to scapegoat our community, they 100% will. And we have to be ready, and we have to be, again, we have to come together, not just Asian Americans, but all Americans. An attack on one community is an attack on all of us, and we have to be in solidarity.
Yeah, that's a really strong point. I think it's something that we also touched upon in the beginning, which is, this hate is intersectional, right? It's not like there's just one person who hates all Asians, a different person that hates all African Americans. This is all intersectional. It's all swirled into each other. And I think technology in a lot of ways is aiding that confluence of different types of hate and bigotry. Emily is sort of kind of on that same note. There's a question that is, what role is misogyny playing in fueling real world hate, and how can it be addressed? They mentioned, this is from Kim Alexander from the California Voter Foundation. They said, research into people arrested in connection with January 6th insurrection found several of those arrested have criminal records of domestic violence, rape, sexual assault, etc. So are there also other behavioral signals that similarly correlate? If you are, in other words, if you exhibit hatred towards one group, are you more likely to exhibit hatred towards other groups? Emily, I can start with you, and obviously anyone else can jump in as well.
Sure. We've certainly seen that across history, right? Even within the Asian American community, we kind of see this jumping from one minority group to another throughout history. So, first it was the Chinese Americans are taking our jobs after the gold rush and the railroad. And then it was, Japanese Americans are suspicious because they're still loyal to their home country. So let's, incarcerate them all. It's like you're taking turns blaming minorities. And so there's never, one group that is inherently flawed that we hate for a real reason. It's whatever's convenient at the time. And I think we see that now, There's this effort to kind of play minority groups against each other. There's an effort to increase anti-Blackness within the Asian community. And those ignore the movements that we're really proud to have come from, where, labor farm workers in California, Latinx and Filipinos, like, work together. We know that we come from the legacy of Grace Lee Boggs and Yuri Kochiyama working with Black civil rights leaders, and that kind of gets erased. And I think it's, it is a tool of white supremacy to kind of erase the history that we have of coalition and working together for our collective liberation, and instead try to turn us against each other. And on the question that was asked, about misogyny, you certainly saw that with the Atlanta spa shootings. Unfortunately, it wasn't just a race issue, right? It was the mixture of the gender issues, as well as like immigrants, like the outsider, religious implications as well. And it was this individual who was troubled for many reasons and found avenues for hate in the Asian American, female community because of the combination of all those things. So it's not, like Brad said, it is intersectional. We can't isolate any of these variables. We really have to think about it comprehensively.
Thanks, Emily. That's super powerful. So we have a little bit of time left. I'm going to group two more technical questions and direct them at Khurram as our tech support here, and then we'll close on a more broader question. So Khurram, two questions real quick. The first from anonymous, I think it's an anonymous individual, not anonymous itself. They ask, while much of the chatter of hate groups is explicit, hate groups also operate in symbols, which might not be immediately obvious to those outside of the network, i.e. Pepe the Frog, and other symbols. So how can platforms stay on top of this chatter in order to take proactive measures against it? The second one that I'm going to lump in with that is from Daniel Sebel from the International Forum for Democratic Studies. He asks, tracking disinformation on text-based messaging services is fundamentally different than new audio group chat apps like Clubhouse or live streaming platforms like Twitch or YouTube. Are there any tools to sort of handle this particularly unique challenge? And what steps would you like to see audio and live streaming platforms take to moderate extremist content? So Khurram, I'll pose those both to you.
Great, and I think it's the headset, and it's okay. My parents, they don't know what I do. They just tell everybody I work in IT, and everybody was asked me to fix their computer and stuff. So I totally get it. It's also an inside joke. We were just joking about the headset before we got on, so that's where the whole IT thing came up. Sakism South Asian. But anyhow, so yeah, those are really technical questions. So I'm going to say this from the perspective of whether, is it possible to do this? And the second question, whether we should do this, right, is a totally separate question. So the first question with regards to symbols and memes, it's essentially memology, right? Is that when you start basically taking on those platforms, what a lot of the extremists would do is they would just switch it out. And so they'd use words like Google or Facebook or YouTube to refer to like the Holocaust or something else. And so then Google or Facebook would have to like look out for those kind of keywords to do that. So the contextual stuff is there's a lot of stuff out there in machine learning and data science that does this stuff, where you can not only look at a specific keyword, but look at the broader sort of context, and it's getting better and better at doing that. The challenge is that it just changes constantly, and you just need to have a large enough data set that can do that. So again, this raises the question, you could probably just mine social media all day, and you could figure this stuff out a lot faster and more real time. But the question is that, do you want to do that? Do we want to be mining everybody's social media constantly, kind of like what Batman does at is it Dark Knight Rises, where he's got that gigantic monitor, and and Morgan Freeman's like, should we be doing this? And he's like, I don't really care, I got to stop the Joker. And it's a quintessential policy question. It's a question of us as a society. And the counter argument to that is that, imagine on January 6th, if these people that stormed the Capitol had succeeded. Imagine if they had taken over and they overturned the election and the world's most powerful democracy couldn't do anything, right? I mean, that's terrifying. One of my employees, she lives in DC, she lives near the Capitol, and she basically she fled DC for a week while all this stuff was kind of happening. And she's from another part of the country and she never saw anything like this. And so that's really, really scary. That's terrifying. And so those are the kind of trade-offs that we need to make as a society to think about those kind of things. And the second question with regards to audio platforms, and again, machine learning, what it can do is you can transcribe audio and video. Is it particularly great? Not necessarily, but there's ways that you can You can transcribe those platforms, and anything that's on the web at the end of the day is pretty much scrapable. And so even though Facebook and Twitter and Google and YouTube, they say you can't really scrape their platforms, people do them anyway. There's lots of companies that have been scraping those platforms to some degree. And so you can scrape it, you can figure out what's being said. The question is, what do you do with that information? And it's a hard question. Like for me personally, I actually know somebody who was radicalized in the United States. He got radicalized online. He was watching Al Qaeda videos, and then he ended up going to Yemen, and he joined Anwar Olaki, and he was killed in the same drone attack that killed Anwar Olaki. And I never, and I was a young person, and I felt like, I saw him getting radicalized and praising attacking civilians, but I never felt I should go to law enforcement because I didn't want to be seen as a sellout. And there was a point where I thought maybe I should pick up the phone and talk to the FBI, but I was like, I felt like what he was saying, I never thought he would actually go and travel overseas and do something. But it raises a very important question: is that these, it's not just a switch where somebody just sees a YouTube video and they get radicalized and they do something. It has gradations, and so policymakers need to think about that. They need to think about people that are, maybe they're frustrated, like Brad had mentioned, like maybe something's going on in their life, they're economically, underserved, and they want that attention. That there has to be models that we develop to address those concerns as well, that don't involve law enforcement, that don't involve people getting arrested. And there was a person in California whose son got radicalized. He called the FBI, and then they arrested his son, and he got like 20 years. And he was like, "That's not why I called you." So the policy perspective is that, on the one hand, I don't want to see government engaging in mass surveillance. On the other hand, we might want to figure out a way that if somebody has these indicators of potentially being radicalized and talking about violence, that there is a way to off-ramp that person and give them the community support, and let the communities kind of manage those people better and giving them those resources. And like I said, I don't see it as a specific group or target community. I see it as a universal problem. Here in America, as a South Asian, I grew up being bullied. I grew up dealing with lots of slurs and stuff like that. But in South Asia, you're seeing, minorities over there are getting treated in a certain way as well. So let's see it as a human condition and figure out, as a society, as a species, how we want to deal with this challenge. And one of the major problems that we're dealing with. Thank you.
Thanks, Karam. So we have a few minutes left. I just wanted to, kind of take it back a step, and I was going to go to a question from Mark Graham. He's asking a specific question on, what can we as individuals do? He's talking specifically about Facebook, but I'm going to pop that question out to be a more larger question. Generally speaking, we've sort of identified this pipeline of digital hate to real world violence. We've identified some solutions that both the tech industry and policymakers should take. But what can people on an individual level do to, in some ways specifically counter digital hate, but also more generally, what can they be doing to sort of confront all these waves of hate that we're seeing against different types of communities? So I'll go around and ask each person the same question. Brad, why don't you start us off?
I am one of those people on Facebook that gets in conversations with my Facebook friends. And it's just the nature of, I grew up in Jersey, very blue collar town. A lot of my friends are still in that town. And the reality is, these imagined communities, as we call them, are real. And when people post things and they have an echo chamber that just agrees with them, they're just going to keep doing that thing. And I think sometimes it's very easy in our sort of media landscape, it's very bifurcated, for us not to have the hard conversations and to just say, that's my childhood friend, I'm just going to let them go on their racist rant, and I'm going to let them do their thing. I think we do have to, and again, I don't think it has to be a confrontation. I think it can be a real conversation. The other thing I think we can all do a better job at is actually knowing who our community is, knowing who our neighbor is 3 houses down to the left and the right. Because again, at the end of the day, hate comes from just not knowing who your community is and not seeing the humanity and the empathy in every person. And because of the internet, because of the fact that people don't know their neighbors anymore, it's so easy to be fomented and to like quite literally hate people for no reason. And so again, I guess my thought is very kumbaya, but we just need to be more active in our communities. I think a lot of times we think we need to attack hate digitally, I think we need to attack hate in real life, and again, I'm a little league baseball coach. I think that that's the biggest way that I can have a positive impact on my community. It's not the videos that get millions of views or, social impact. It's the community that I live in. And I think we just need to do a better job of prioritizing that.
Thanks. That's very helpful. Khurram, go to you and then we'll end with Emily.
Yeah, I think that there's got to be a multi-pronged approach. We got to have a mainstream view. So, for example, when the president of the United States is making incredibly racist comments, to all sorts of groups, I mean, it seemed like he was trying to be the catch-all and just like attack women, attacked Asians, he attacked Muslims, and so much happened under that one administration. It caused, I think, long-lasting damage. So I think that there has to be a mainstream kind of perspective. I think when you go into these digital spaces, I think something that Brad mentioned is very important, is that human touch is a great way to pull people out of these networks. I think that there's a broader issue of general misinformation that that the big tech companies can start. And I think what they need to do is they need to open source their solutions. They can't just hog it all for themselves. They should create APIs for the broader tech community that anybody can plug into. And maybe they pay a nominal fee, maybe it's completely free. But the idea is that they can keep that hate off of as many platforms as possible. So as an example, I don't know that much about specific communities, hate speech being directed at them. I don't know what slurs people are using targeting people of Asian descent. And then, I'm not an expert on anti-Semitism or anti-Black sentiment, but I think those communities know they know the hate speech when they see it, and they can help these bigger tech companies develop recognition of that kind of content. And then they can make those things available through an API so that if somebody's posting, anti-Black sentiment on Facebook, they don't go to like another platform and do that. So I think that universalizing and making it more consistent is something that's very important. So there's a lot of solutions that are out there. And I think that as a society, we need to kind of push this conversation forward and not just see it as a temporary sort of outbreak, but something that's going to be with us. And it's going to get more and more dangerous if we don't do something about it.
Thank you very much. Emily, final thought for you.
Sure. First, I just want to say I completely agree with that last point. I think it's really important that we all collaborate across industry, but also across companies and different minority groups, because it is going to take all of us, and it is a problem that isn't going to go away. For the audience, just immediate takeaways and things you can do right away. I think it's really important that all of us listen to victims and learn about the history and the experiences of our neighbors, like Brad said, and think about it as not, you're not being a good Samaritan by listening and learning this, Asian American history, Black history. It's all American history. It's a part of our shared story. And we have, knowingly or unknowingly, all played a role in perpetuating the negative issues that we face in the US. And so we have to be a part of the solution together. It's going to take all of us. The second thing I'd say is to center and promote minority voices in every realm, right? Not just on hate issues, not just fill in the blank Heritage Month or fill in the blank holiday, not just on the trust and safety teams, not just on the international relations teams, but on every single issue, because we are American, and the way that we build these products, that we have policy discussions, all of that should factor in the experiences of our very diverse society, not just center on one profile that has been in power for a long time. So I think that's going to be critical to addressing some of the root causes of all this. And then the last most practical thing that you can do right away is AAJC with our partner Hollaback. We host bystander intervention trainings almost every week, where you can log on Zoom and learn about microaggressions all the way to violent incidents and what you can do on that spectrum, how you can be a good ally, how you can intervene when you see it in real time, and actually literally stop that hate incident from happening, right? And I think that's an example of, we've spent a lot of time talking about how tech is risky, how it can perpetuate negative things, but it can also be a tool. And we've seen a lot of organizers really push for great content, for collaboration, for better education, and like Brad's folks do better stories and narratives about the people who are being affected and can play an integral role in solving these issues. So there's that as well.
Awesome, Emily, that was the perfect note to end on. I want to thank everybody on the panel for joining. This has been an incredibly helpful conversation. I want to thank all our attendees. And as I said before, we're hoping that this becomes a regular series of conversations here at Aspen Digital, because we do, 100% agree with Emily and what the rest of the panelists have said, that this is a very important aspect of including communities in every conversation that affects them, and not just have conversations about them. So thank you all very much. We hope that you will continue to follow Aspen Digital and our work, and we will have this up on the web sometime very soon. So until next time, thank you very much, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.